I never thought the people who gave me life would be the ones to essentially sign my death warrant. But when the bills started piling up and my hair started falling out, my parents decided that my negativity was too much for their curated, perfect lifestyle, and they walked out on me in the middle of chemotherapy. Can you even imagine looking your child in the eye while they're hooked up to an IV and telling them that you need to focus on your own mental health instead of helping them survive? I want you to listen to what happened and tell me honestly. Was I wrong for the way I handled this, or did they get exactly what they deserved? This whole nightmare started about 2 years ago when I was 24, just starting to feel like I had my life together with a steady job as a junior graphic designer and a small but cozy apartment I decorated myself, when I got the diagnosis that changed everything. It was stage 3 Hodgkin's lymphoma, and suddenly my world wasn't about career goals, weekend brunches, or dating. It was about survival rates, white blood cell counts, and insurance premiums that were spiraling out of control. My parents, David and Susan, had always been the type of people who cared deeply about appearances above all else. They were the pillars of their local country club, always dressed in the latest designer collections, and obsessed with the idea of being seen as a perfect, blessed family. When I first told them, they were devastated, or at least they acted like it for the benefit of our relatives, posting long-winded updates on Facebook about their brave daughter to farm for likes and sympathy. They would take selfies with me in the hospital room when I still looked somewhat healthy, using my tragedy as a way to boost their social standing. But the moment the treatment started taking its real toll, their devotion began to crack. Chemotherapy isn't pretty, and it certainly isn't aesthetic. I was constantly nauseous. I lost 60 pounds until I looked like a skeleton draped in skin, and I was too weak to even walk to the bathroom some days without collapsing. My mother would come over for 20 minutes, smelling of expensive perfume that made my stomach churn, and spend the whole time complaining about how hard it was for her to see me like this, how it was ruining her sleep, and making her anxious to be around so much sickness. She would literally stand at the far end of the room, clutching her designer handbag like a shield, refusing to touch the surfaces in my apartment as if my cancer were a virus she could catch by accident. She'd bring me these expensive organic juices I couldn't even swallow and then get offended when I threw them up, claiming I was being difficult on purpose. She even had the nerve to tell me that my pale, sickly complexion was clashing with the upbeat decor of her guest room, which was the first sign they didn't want me around. My father was even worse. He started dropping hints that I should have planned better for an emergency like this, as if I could have predicted a life-threatening illness in my 20s, and he openly complained that my medical bills and the time they spent checking on me were becoming an eyesore on their lifestyle. He actually had the nerve to ask if I could wear a wig when their friends came over because the sight of my bald head made everyone uncomfortable during dinner. He would spend the entire visit looking at his phone, checking the stock market or replying to work emails, barely acknowledging the fact that I was fighting for every breath in front of him. Every time they visited, it felt like an interrogation or a high-stakes performance where I was failing my lines by simply being too sick to entertain them. My mother would sit at the very edge of my bed, barely touching me, and talk incessantly about her Pilates classes, the new drapes she was picking out for the sunroom, or the toxic energy of the hospital staff, completely ignoring the fact that I was shivering under 3 blankets and struggling to catch my breath. They started making pathetic excuses to skip my most important oncology appointments, saying the hospital atmosphere was too draining for their spirits, and that they needed to maintain a high vibration to stay healthy themselves. They began ignoring my texts asking for simple things, like a ride to the pharmacy or help with groceries, claiming they were detoxing from technology to handle the stress I was causing them. One afternoon, I was so weak I couldn't open a jar of applesauce, and I sat on my kitchen floor crying for 40 minutes because I couldn't reach them on the phone. I remember one specific, horrific night when my fever spiked to 104 degrees and I was hallucinating from the pain. I called them crying, absolutely terrified that I wouldn't make it through the night. My mother answered the phone and whispered that they were at a black tie gala for a local charity and that I should just call the night nurse because she simply couldn't deal with the drama right now. She actually told me to think positive thoughts and hung up to go back to her appetizers while I lay in the dark, wondering if I would wake up the next morning. The breaking point came when I finally lost my job because I couldn't keep up with the hours while being poisoned by chemo, and I asked them, begged them, if I could move back home for just 3 months while I finished my most intense round of treatment. I was broke, I was physically decaying, and I just needed a place to sleep where I didn't have to worry about an eviction notice. I thought that surely, in my darkest hour, the people who raised me would open their doors and show some shred of humanity. But I was wrong. They sat me down in my own tiny living room, looking at me with a mix of pity and genuine annoyance, and my father had the nerve to say that bringing that kind of heavy, sickly energy into their home would be detrimental to their marriage and their social standing. He looked at me and said that their house was a place of joy and light, and my illness was a dark cloud they weren't prepared to host. He said they had worked hard for their retirement, and they didn't want to spend it being full-time caregivers to someone who didn't even have a plan for the future. They told me right then and there that they had decided to go on a 3-month luxury Mediterranean cruise to recharge and find themselves because the stress of my diagnosis had been so hard on them. My mother actually had the audacity to reach out, pat my hand with her manicured fingers, and say, "We've spent 24 years taking care of you, honey. Now we need to take care of ourselves and our own happiness. You're a big girl, you'll find a way. Maybe this is a lesson from the universe about independence." They literally walked out the door while I was too weak to even stand up and stop them, leaving me with a fridge full of expired milk and a heart that felt like it had been shattered into a million pieces of ice. I lay on that floor for an hour, crying until I had no tears left, realizing I was truly, utterly alone in a world that felt cold and indifferent. For months, I survived on the pure kindness of a few distant friends and the grace of a hospital social worker named Sarah who helped me navigate emergency housing and food banks. I was fighting for my life in a sterile ward while my parents posted photos from the Amalfi Coast, smiling with glasses of vintage champagne and wearing white linen suits while I was praying for my fever to break in a lonely, overcrowded hospital room. I watched their Instagram stories from my hospital bed, seeing them dance on sun-drenched decks and eat 5-course meals while I couldn't even keep down a single cracker. They didn't call on my birthday. They didn't text to see if I survived my surgery. They didn't even send a thinking of you card. They told our extended family that I had chosen to distance myself to focus on my healing, lying to everyone to protect their precious reputation. My own aunts and uncles stopped calling because they believed I was the one being difficult. It was like I had been surgically removed from their family tree the moment I became inconvenient to their brand. I felt like a ghost, a shameful secret they had tucked away because I was no longer a success story they could brag about to their wealthy, superficial friends. I reached a point where I stopped checking their social media, stopped hopping for a text, and stopped thinking of them as my parents. I realized that the people who share your DNA aren't always your family. Sometimes they're just people you happen to be related to by a cruel twist of fate. I spent nights staring at the ceiling, wondering how a mother could sleep on a luxury liner while her daughter was shivering in a clinic, and the only answer I found was that some people are simply incapable of love that requires effort. But then, against every single medical odd and the total lack of support from the people who should have loved me most, I went into remission. The recovery was slow, agonizing, and filled with setbacks, but I did it. I spent a year rebuilding my life from the absolute ashes, working 2 grueling jobs, settling my mountain of debts penny by penny, and slowly hardening my heart into a diamond that nothing could scratch. I learned how to live without them, how to be my own mother and father, and how to find worth in my own grit and survival. I didn't reach out to them once, and they didn't check on me, probably assuming I was either dead or someone else's burden to carry. I moved to a different part of the city, changed my phone number, and started a new life where the word parent meant nothing more than a biological technicality. I made new friends, real friends, people who knew my story and respected my strength. And for the first time in my life, I felt truly supported and seen. I even started a small business, and things were finally looking up. Then, last week, out of nowhere, my father showed up at my new apartment building. I don't even know how he tracked me down, maybe through an old contact or a bank record. But there he was, standing on my doorstep looking like a withered shell of the man he used to be. He looked older, gray, and desperate, and he started crying the very moment he saw me standing there healthy, strong, and glowing with a life he had no part in creating. He told me that my mother was going through a difficult phase, and that he realized they had made a minor mistake by leaving when they did. He started going on about how he was facing some health scares of his own, something about a failing heart valve and chronic exhaustion, and he realized he had no one to lean on because all their friends were just as superficial as they were. He stood there, hat in hand, expecting me to fall into his arms and offer him the very comfort and care he denied me when I was staring death in the face. He actually had the balls to say, "We're family, after all, and family always comes back together in the end when things get tough. We need each other now, and your mother and I want to make things right. We want you to come home and help us through this." He talked as if the last 2 years were just a long weekend where we had a slight disagreement. The sheer, unadulterated hypocrisy of it made my blood run cold and my vision go sharp. He actually expected me to drop everything to nurse him back to health after he left me to die in an empty apartment while he drank cocktails on a boat. So that's the situation I was in, and I had to make a choice that would define the rest of my life and finally close the door on my past. Before I tell you what happened next, and the 4 words that absolutely shattered his soul and left him speechless in the hallway, I want you to pause and comment below what you would have done in my shoes. Would you forgive a parent who left you to die for the sake of a cruise, or would you shut the door forever? Would you be the bigger person for someone who didn't even treat you like a person when you were at your most vulnerable? Seriously, tell me, is there any amount of family duty that justifies forgiving that kind of cold-blooded betrayal? I want to know your honest thoughts because people keep telling me that family is everything, but I think those people have never been truly abandoned. I looked my father straight in his watery eyes, the man who had abandoned me when I was at my lowest, the man who chose a buffet on a boat over his daughter's survival, and I didn't yell, I didn't scream, and I didn't cry a single tear. I didn't give him the satisfaction of seeing me angry or letting him think he still had any power over my emotions. I didn't want him to think I had spent even 1 second of my new life hatting him. I simply looked at him with total, chilling indifference, as if he were a telemarketer who had interrupted my dinner, and I simply said, "Who are you again?" The look of absolute, soul-crushing shock on his face was the most satisfying thing I have ever experienced. His jaw literally dropped, and he started stammering, trying to remind me that he was my father, that he had raised me, that he was the man who bought me my first car and paid for my college. He reached out to touch my arm, his hand shaking with age and fear, but I stepped back like he was a total stranger asking for spare change on the street. I kept that blank, polite, customer service smile on my face like I was talking to a confused delivery driver who had wandered into the wrong building. I told him that the daughter he knew died during chemotherapy because she didn't have a father to hold her hand or a mother to dry her tears. So he must be at the entirely wrong address, looking for someone who no longer exists in this world. I explained to him that the girl who needed him is gone, buried under the weight of his abandonment, and the woman standing here owes him nothing, not even a single minute of my time. He tried to push his way in, talking about family blood and divine forgiveness, and how I was being unreasonably cruel to an old, sick man who just wanted to make amends. I looked him dead in his eyes and told him that blood is just something I had to have transfused because mine was failing while he was in Greece, and he wasn't there to give it then, so he doesn't get to claim it now. I told him that if he wanted a daughter, he should have stayed when I was bald, vomiting, and terrified, not waited until I was healthy, successful, and didn't need a single dime or a single word from him. I told him that my survival was a miracle he didn't earn a share of, and that he should probably check into a private hospital if he was so sick, because I certainly wasn't his nurse, and I certainly wasn't his family anymore. I told him to leave before I called the police on a trespassing stranger. I closed the door on him while he was still mid-sentence, the sound of the deadbolt clicking shut, feeling like the final, beautiful period at the end of a very long, very painful chapter of my life. I watched through the peephole as he stood in the hallway for 10 minutes, sobbing and leaning against the wall, looking at the door like he expected it to magically open again, before finally slinking away like a beaten dog. My mother has been blowing up my phone through various block number apps ever since, calling me heartless, cruel, and unnatural, saying that I'm punishing them for a simple lapse in judgment and that I'll regret this when they're both gone. She sent me a long email saying that they did their best, given the circumstances, and that I'm being melodramatic about the past, claiming that they sent me positive energy while they were away, and that should have been enough. She even tried to guilt-trip me by saying my father's heart condition was my fault because of the stress I caused them during my treatment. But I don't see it as punishment. I see it as the natural consequence of their own terminal selfishness. They wanted a life without the burden of a sick child, and now they have exactly what they asked for, a life without me in it at all. They taught me how to be alone when I was dying, and now they're upset that I'm actually better at it than they are now that they're the ones in need. I've blocked their numbers, their emails, and told the rest of the extended family that if they take their side or try to guilt-trip me into reconciling, they can stay out of my life too. I am finally surrounding myself with a chosen family of people who actually show up when things get ugly, who hold the bucket when you're sick and hold your hand when you're scared, not just when there's a photo op or champagne to be popped. I've learned that loyalty is earned through action, not inherited through birth, and that some bridges are worth burning to keep yourself warm and safe from the people who would see you freeze. I spent so many years trying to be the perfect daughter for people who only wanted a trophy, and now I'm finally free to be the person who survived. Life is far too short to spend it on people who only love you when the sun is shining and the weather is perfect, only to vanish at the first sign of a storm. If you think I was right to walk away and give him that cold reality check, like this video to show your support for everyone who has had to cut out toxic family members to save their own peace. It's been a long, hard road to recovery, both physically and emotionally, and your support truly means the world to me. I'm finally living my life on my own terms, healthy and happy, and I refuse to let toxic people back in just because they happen to share my DNA. Please subscribe for more stories about standing your ground, finding strength in the face of ultimate betrayal, and learning that chosen family is often 1,000 times stronger than the one you're born into. Share your final thoughts on this whole mess in the comments section. Did I go too far by pretending not to know him, or was, "Who are you again?" the only logical response for a man who treated me like a ghost? I'll be reading every single comment to see how you would have handled such a toxic situation. I'll see you all in the next story.